Thank you, thank you. So welcome to the Fallacious Belief in Government. I'm Jeffrey Hann, I'm with Journalistic Revolution. I am an anarchist, but I'm not Antifa, they're not anarchists, I actually believe in property rights. Let's see. Early on in my career, I got into information technology, got into routers, servers, switches, web design, things like that. I ended up joining the military. I went infantry for the first couple of years, and then switched careers in the military and started doing cyber intelligence with Army Cyber Command, where I had a top secret clearance, and I focused on open source intelligence. From there, I got into product and software development and the life cycle of those processes and focused on the analysis work of that. Let's see, for education-wise, I have 3 AS degrees, 1 in intelligence operations, and I have my MBA in IT management. Over the years, I've gotten really good at researching information and finding just the open source information and gathering intelligence and analyzing that data. So I prefer to live my life through natural rights that everyone has, life, freedom, and property. These are like my core principles that I try to do my daily life with. One thing I do want to bring up is that I was diagnosed with dyslexia when I was younger, and I've always viewed it as a very negative piece because it was always a challenge that I had to try to overcome. However, recently I discovered that those with dyslexia tend to have a higher awareness of pattern recognition, which I think plays into why I've been able to determine and figure out the things that I'm going to be presenting today and what I'll be presenting at the Fire Steel Hub on Saturday at 6. So let's get right into it. So my book, as Alex was talking about, COVID-19, Short Path to You'll Own Nothing and You'll Be Happy, Welcome to the New Age of Tyranny. I cover about 182 actual references, 141 of those being published journal studies. So highly detailed, very, very in-depth. I published this last year in February, and it was 2 weeks before the FBI and the Department of Energy came out and said that the COVID-19 actually came from a lab leak, which is what I've been maintaining ever since December of 2019. Does anyone know where You'll Own Nothing and You'll Be Happy came from? Anyone? Anyone? Who said it first? Well, Alex ruined it. Anyways, yes, it was the World Economic Forum. So in my book, I cover a lot of things. The first part of my book is pretty much what this slide is about. So as with all of my work and everything I do, I first discuss the trivium method of critical thinking. I learned the trivium in 2015. I learned a new way of processing information and how to think critically as a skill set using this process. The first step is using grammar, which is our input. This is where we determine a systematic body of knowledge, our objective truths, our subjective truths. We gather all of our definitions, root definitions, the themes and context around those words. And this is why this is where you hash out semantics, because semantics is very important for and vital for correct communication with other people. If you're both using terms and you both think different definitions to those terms, you're not going to be able to really communicate properly. One example I like to use is the definition of patriot. The word patriot, its root definition comes from fellow countrymen, which country is a landmass controlled by a government in this context. And so if you love your country, you love your government in that sentence. Now, in the 18th century, patriot also meant a factious disturber of the government, which our founders, were they fellow countrymen, redcoats to the tyrannical British government, or were they factious disturbers of a tyrannical government? And so when you take those two definitions, now look at Thomas Jefferson's quote about the Tree of Liberty and how that the blood of tyrants and patriots need to be spilled to refresh the Tree of Liberty. Well, which definition did he mean? This is why context and theme is important. Next up is logic. This is where we do all of the processing of all the information we've gathered in grammar. For logic, you first look at yourself and you remove all your inherent contradictions, your logical fallacies, your cognitive biases, and then you also remove those from other people's rhetoric when they're talking to you. An example of this is the broken window fallacy. Government loves using the broken window fallacy. Government breaks something, then they force Paul to pay Peter to then fix that broken item, and then they go, look how good the economy is doing. Well, really, the economy's not doing good. It's a net negative because the window was broken when it didn't need to be broken. That is, in the nutshell, what the broken window fallacy is. Rhetoric, this is where you get to the difference between persuasion and manipulation. Persuasion is all, and manipulation is all about intent. Our intent should be to persuade people to freedom and liberty and things like that, while the government uses manipulation to get what they want. And so there's a difference between when you see politicians who live in the world of rhetoric, they specifically talk about manipulation versus persuasion. And then last is that rhetoric is the actionable conclusion based on the grammar and logic that we just discussed. For this simple diagram shows how the trivium really works, and it's all about metacognition, being aware of the actual process. You have to actually think about the process and the steps while you're going through it to actually build critical thinking as a skill set. Grammar, logic, rhetoric, in order, but anytime new information is presented, at any point it goes back to grammar and you figure out what's true, what's not, and then move through the whole process again. So it's really key about being self-aware of the process while you're thinking to actually grow it, instead of just having an innate ability of being able to critically think. So on to government. How do you define it? What does it really mean to you? Like when you think about government, do you feel a sense of optimism and joy that you're really proud of the government, or is it a tyrannical thing? And then lastly is the belief in government a fallacy? I will resoundingly say yes, it is a fallacy to believe in it, and we will discuss all of that as we go through this. So first step is the grammar aspect of it, and we talk about what government actually is defined as, and it's govern plus ment. Dash ment is a tool or action, and govern is the control. So government is a tool or action of control over the innocent, and that's the key, is that it's over the innocent that I want to talk about and why that idea of government is a fallacy. And then so I'm going to pose this additional question to you. Can innocent people be free if they're being controlled? And the idea of free, actually, the context of it and theme comes from the freedom of movement, your ability to walk around and things like that. If you're being controlled, you actually don't have freedom. So you can't have freedom and be controlled at the same time. So government actually has a life cycle. I know a lot of people like to say that our country is a country founded on constitutional republic, and that's what we still are. But then you hear people talking about democracy and things like that, and that we got to protect democracy and things like that. Well, thousands of years ago, Plato described government and its life cycle in his book 8 of his Republic. And in that, he discusses, and I'm just going to focus on these last two steps, is democracy, then tyranny. Rinse and repeat. That means that government had patterned enough for him to realize that there was a life cycle and that it always goes from democracy to tyranny. And from that point till now, nothing has changed. After tyranny comes revolution, which just reverts us back to an earlier form of statism. Where do you think we are today? We are right there. Everyone's talking about saving democracy, but that's because we're now entering this new phase of tyranny. And I want to point out that it's not just a single country or government becoming tyrannical, it's the entire world. It is a global government that is becoming tyrannical, and we've now entered this new phase of tyranny. President Ford said, "A government big enough to give you everything you want is a government big enough to take from you everything you have." This is still true today, and it is a vital importance that we remember that concept. So a lot of people like to say that government is here to protect and serve us. You used to see those on police enforcement officers on their vehicles and moving around and driving around. It said, protect and serve, protect and serve. But really, is that true? Because all of those words, protect and serve, started falling away, but still people like to use of why we need government. It's because it's to protect and serve us. So the first court case I want to bring up, Warren versus District of Columbia. This court case determined and set the precedence that the government does not have a duty to protect or serve any citizen. They don't have to provide any services. They don't have to offer protection. You could be drowning and a government agent can just sit there and watch and not do anything because they don't actually have a duty to protect and serve. The second court case I want to discuss is Tyranny versus Winnebago County Department of Social Services. This court case set the precedence that the government actually does have a duty to protect and serve, but only those physically restrained within those care. People in the prison system, jails, typically for criminals. I like to contend that that is really the only a tool or action of control really should be for criminals, not for the innocent people who aren't criminals. So protecting and serving, what does that really mean? If the government doesn't have a duty to protect and serve, then what is a police enforcement officer? Police has the same definition as policy. Its root comes from the same word as policy, which is way of management. Enforcement actually comes from constraint and compulsion, rape, the idea of forced violence. So what is a police enforcement officer? They are the policy enforcers for those ruling over us. They are not peacekeepers, and they have been militarized over decades. Now, I do want to say that it's specifically the job that's a problem, not necessarily the individual, but it's always the individual when they're at the job specifically, because their job is to enforce the policies, not to actually protect and serve. George Mason said, once a standing army is established in any country, the people lose their liberty. And that's true. And as we now see that we have a standing army, we have actually two, the police enforcement and our actual military. And both of those are established and here as we enter this new phase of tyranny in this police state that we have. I would like to also point out that there is no law too small that the government will not kill over. So jaywalking, anything like that, they will absolutely shoot you over it if given the chance. So I do want to talk, let's see, the Constitution. Second Amendment is one of my favorite ones to discuss. It's well debated, and people like to talk about specifically the idea of bearing arms. Now, bearing arms, that if it's a lowercase a, is the idea of doing military service, fighting in a military, things like that. However, because this is a capital, it's about things. And so with the definition of arms, it's anything military. You can even talk about like the coat of arms, so the U.S. flag. That is a coat of arms for the U.S. government. Soldiers wear this coat of arms when they go into the battlefield. So the right to keep and bear arms means that we have the right to use any weapons of war in our defense against a tyrannical government, and our founding fathers were very, very clear about this message. So when people talk about it, they actually get lost in it. From that, I do want to bring up this. In 2016, I wrote an article on what made America great, and the only thing I could actually find on what made America great was our very act of defiance. So I came up with this slogan, Make America Defiant Again, and created this design. I actually do have some extra large sweaters with this design on it, if anyone is interested. The second thing I want to talk about with the Constitution is the 13th Amendment. How many believe the 13th Amendment abolished slavery? Anyone? Good job. So it says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for a crime where the party shall have been duly convicted. That exception is key, and most people forget and miss that that exception is there. That exception basically listed slavery as a constitutional protected act, so that if the government finds you duly convicted of any crime, and any crime is whatever government says it is, jaywalking, things like that, you can be turned into an involuntary servitude or a slave. Now, I like to point out that if the Constitution allows slavery, then is it really a good litmus test for what is morally and ethical correct in our society? And I like to also argue that the Constitution is just a piece of paper that the government violates at every single step along the way, all the time, and they have no punishment for it. So really, how good is the Constitution? It was a fantastic document when it was first created, and one of the best written documents outlining rights and freedoms, but it's not perfect, and we can definitely do better. Now, from this, to think about it, our prison system has almost 2 million people within our prison system. Each one of them, and a majority of them, are actually there for victimless crimes. So those people who didn't create any victim have a potential to be slaves in this current system. So the next up I would like to talk about is the U.S. education system. And this was a big one for me when I learned about all of this and was researching it. So our education system is actually comprised of two different systems. I'll talk about the first one here, the classical trivium. It was designed by the Catholic Church, and it was used to create a circled and systematic body of knowledge that they kept people in. So anyone who tried to step outside of this body of knowledge would get their hands slapped, and you can actually see that in universities and public education today, where when people try to think outside of what they're being told, they're shot down and discredited immediately. This system actually is used to create literacy slaves, those smart enough to work but not smart enough to think for themselves. This is how they removed the actual ability to critically think outside of our public education system. Second is the Prussian education system. The Prussian education system was adopted in the mid-1800s, and the Prussian education system was developed by the Prussians after their army lost against Napoleon. And their parliament researched it on why did we lose this war. Well, they determined that soldiers were thinking for themselves. So what they did was they came up with this system that was used to focus on building blind obedience towards authority. Now, our public education system comprises these two. So we have now had generations upon generations of people who have been indoctrinated into becoming literacy slaves who have blind obedience towards authority, which is one reason why we are in this mess that we see today. Taxation is theft. This is one of my favorite topics. In 2016, my very first article that I wrote was actually a 7-page response to someone on why taxation is theft. My work was actually quoted and memed by the Free Thought Project during this time, which I thought was pretty cool when that happened, especially since it was my first article that I had written. So what is a tax? It's a compulsory contribution. Compulsory means force, contribution means payment. So a tax is a forced payment for services we may or may not use, and the government doesn't have to give it to us, even if they take everything from us. And for the majority, taxes go to paying interest rates on the Federal Reserve printing money. Next, theft is taking of another person's property without their permission or consent, and this is by the definitions of it why taxation is theft. Taxes, if you actually look into what taxes are out there, there is a never-ending, growing list of different types of taxes. Sales tax, employees tax, death and estate tax. They get you coming and going every chance they can. The government will absolutely steal from you. Next is that the federal tax laws and regulations in 2015 had over 10 million words, and that has only increased. I couldn't find an exact number for an updated version for like last year or this year, so I had to stick with the 2015, but it has grown only since then. The U.S. government is currently $35 trillion in debt, and again, our taxes are going to paying the interest on that debt, and it's only significantly increasing. I just saw a thing this morning saying that in the next 15 years, 20 years, they're projecting that the U.S. government's debt will increase to $51 trillion. I'm betting it's going to happen significantly faster than what they're predicting. Two things. The DoD officially reported, one, on the day before 9/11, they reported that they couldn't account for $2.4 trillion. And then, of course, the very next day 9/11 happened, everyone stopped talking about it, and all of the financial information and the auditors were all destroyed and killed in the Pentagon attack. Convenient. Then in July of 2016, the DoD came out again and said that they couldn't account for another $6.5 trillion. But what did the news do? They focused only on Trump and Clinton and their battle, and completely ignored that the government still couldn't account for everything. Each year, billions goes to foreign countries, either in helping further additional wars or money laundering. So all of these reasons are just anecdotal information on why taxation is theft and an immoral practice. And it really comes from the Catholic Church's tithings that they have, which were forced contributions for their coffers. Engineered consent. So this is where I want to discuss the difference between informed consent and engineered consent. Consent is the voluntary acceptance and agreement and sentiment in a given situation. Voluntary acceptance and agreement. We have to know what we're talking about and what we're consenting to, or it's not real consent. This is why children cannot consent to a lot of can't consent to adult things. What makes sex not rape? Consent. What makes taking someone's money or property not theft? Consent. Consent must be informed and given freely. So how does the government obtain consent? Well, they engineer it. They use pressures from intimidation, threats, and violence. They view silence as consent, and they use manipulation tactics, psyops, and propaganda. All of this was seen during COVID, and you can actually see this in any situation that happens. You will find these things on how they obtain their consent. Now, all of those, does that sound like informed consent or engineered consent? So next up is psychological operations. This is a long list of stuff that is currently going on and has been going on for a long time. Terrorism. So let's talk about the definition of terrorism. Terror and terrorism, actually, the term was coined during the French Revolution when the French government was committing atrocities against its citizens. So the definition of terror and terrorism is a government action against a populace. So the US government, based on that, is the world's largest terrorist organization. And interesting enough, in 2019, the FBI decided that conspiracy theorists were domestic terrorists. And so now they have slowly morphed the idea of, if you don't believe government-approved rhetoric and you believe that it's being done on purpose, that you are a domestic terrorist, when reality is, by definition, the government is actually the terrorist. Government loves using propaganda. They use propaganda all the time. You saw that in COVID. They would hire celebrities, things like that, to say, hey, look how good the vaccines are, or look how good this is, you should do that. They use propaganda all the time to basically drum fear and things like that. Mainstream media. Mainstream media, if you actually look at all of the different platforms of mainstream media, Fox, MSNBC, CBS, all of them, when you look at their news, you'll actually can find videos out there where each platform is saying word for word the same speech across all over the US. Well, that shows that they are actually all connected and not independent news organizations. And I'll go further into that later. I do want to point out that mainstream media picked up the term fake news in 2016. That term actually came from a professor in California who did not want all of their students going through a bunch of different sites and providing information for whatever they were working on. I bring this up is because one of the sites on there was Liberty Movement Radio, which I actually co-owned with several other people at the time. So I thought that was a pretty funny thing that the viralness of fake news came from that list, which I had part of. Next up is controlled opposition. Controlled opposition is when someone who is potentially on your side, but really is working for the opposite side. You find them all the time. Controlled opposition will actually infiltrate all party platforms, the Libertarian Party, the right, the left, it doesn't matter. There's controlled opposition in all of them, and they're used. Notable people that I would say are controlled opposition would be Trump, Biden, Tucker Carlson, Elon Musk. Those are the big things, and I actually detail all of them in my book. Next up would be censorship. Censorship is a big thing. Recently, it's definitely come to light that the government was heavily involved with social media companies censoring people during the COVID pandemic. This was clearly a violation of the First Amendment, but government doesn't care and nothing's going to happen to them anyways. But you can still find accounts being throttled, their reach being removed, and it's because they talk about something that goes against the approved government rhetoric. All of my accounts have all been censored over the years, and it's definitely a challenge trying to get information out there when you're being censored, but it is what it is. Next will be the deep fakes. Deep fakes are when videos, sound, audio recordings, things like that are computer generated or edited to where what's being spoken about and discussed is actually not true. These deep fakes are getting better and better, and sometimes it's actually really hard to see the difference and spot a deep fake. Government has been using deep fakes forever, and it's only getting easier to trick and confuse people. Last is the sock puppet accounts. These are actually social media accounts that are either being generated and ran by bots, or they have an actual human behind them, and they are all displaying the same message. You can go out there and research and find Twitter accounts where everyone is saying word for word the same exact information. These are all sock puppet accounts. There's actually schools and military colleges that are training tens of thousands of analysts and PSYOP specialists to go and help run these type of sock puppet accounts and deep fakes. And that's just for the US government. Every government does the exact same thing. Every government has an army of individuals to help try to generate and create the narrative about what is currently being discussed. So what is a conspiracy theorist? Or a conspiracy theory? I am a huge conspiracy theorist, but this is what I consider a conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theory is a point of view that a group is plotting something sinister, often in secret, using direct movements and actions to control what is being seen, like in the sense of theater. So conspiracies are absolutely real. Not all conspiracies are real. Some conspiracies are psychological operations with information put out there to discredit the truth. This actually, the negative connotations that's around conspiracy theory, it came from the CIA in 1967. In 1967, the CIA put out a memorandum saying that they were going to start convincing people that conspiracy theory was just a crackpot idea, tinfoil hat wearing thing. And it was the reason they did this was to discredit discredit the theories around JFK's assassination. And they've only continued this. So we've had decades now of people assuming that conspiracy theory was just some crackpot idea, when reality is that there's actually legitimate truths behind a lot of these things. So conspiracies. Are governments willing to commit voting fraud to elect pre-selected candidates, the controlled opposition of what I was talking about? So let's talk about the GOP in 2012. I had friends in Tampa at the time who were there. Ron Paul absolutely should have won the nomination. They changed the rules on the floor, they discredited and threw out all of his delegates, and they basically handed the nomination over to Mitt Romney. Now they can do this because the GOP is actually a private organization, and they can pretty much do whatever they want and change the rules within reason. But that set the stage for me when I noticed that to where I am at today, seeing how that happens. Now, if the individual and the nominee is a controlled opposition, is the vote really valuable, your vote to them really valuable if they're controlled opposition? Or if things are being changed, it really negates the true power of what voting should be. Next up I'd like to discuss is the DNC in 2016. Now, Bernie Sanders should have been the one to win that nominee. Regardless of how awful his policies are and things like that, Sanders absolutely should have been the nominee, but it was given to Clinton. Well, from the DNC leak, we learned that Clinton and the DNC were colluding together to steal the nomination from Bernie Sanders. This leak, of course, the DNC and Clinton immediately jumped on that it was the Russians. The Russians hacked their servers. Not that the information was wrong, just that it was Russian interference that was causing all of that. However, Seth Rich, who was a DNC voter expansion data director, from my research, seems like it was the most likely candidate for the actual DNC leak to WikiLeaks, which Julian Assange, in an interview with a Dutch cable news network, actually even hinted that Seth Rich was the DNC leaker, and they offered a $20,000 reward because at 4 in the morning one night in his neighborhood, he was shot twice in the back in what the police say is a botched robbery. Now you can take the information as is, and you can say, well, it really was, and it was due to Russians, or it was a leak by him, and it was Clinton, who has a long list of bodies behind her, took out someone who leaked information. Now, of course, the week that he was murdered, she then used his murder as justification for greater gun control. Next up is electronic voting. Dominion, ES&S, and Hart Interval City. Dominion's the biggest one right now because they actually just won their defamation lawsuit against Fox with a huge payout. There's actually a bunch of lawsuits going on still, especially in Arizona and a couple other places that are trying to move their way up through a unjust court system, trying to prove that the voting machines were actually completely unsecure. Either passwords were not encrypted, everyone that logged in or did anything was under one specific account, meaning there was no audit trail on if votes were being changed and by who, things like that. So all of that happens, and obviously they're still fighting it, but now if you've noticed that a lot of states, especially the blue states, are starting to enact laws saying that if you say that voting fraud is going on, it can be a criminal charge. Now, obviously that's just pushing more tyranny. In 2019, a group of Democrats sent an official letter to these 3 companies or corporations asking for the identification on who actually owns them. But because they're private and not public, they have no idea who the actual the private ownership is of those corporations. Now, that information, that letter was sent out, and no information since then has been presented. So we still have no idea if it's foreign governments or anything like that that actually own these companies or are influencing things. So really, can we trust them? On top of that, then there's people that like stuff the mailbox, where they just send in a bunch of votes for a specific election. There was actually, this past week, I saw someone that actually got arrested for stuffing ballot boxes. I forget which state. Next up is non-citizens. The government is pushing really hard to have non-citizens vote, which for this type of system that we're in is definitely, it should be a no-no, because you could always import 1 million people and have them vote exactly the way you want, which completely negates all the citizens' actual voting power. And then last up for this one is actual foreign influence. Russia, China, all of them actually influence our elections, every single election, even down to smaller ones, but we also do the same thing to them. And I would actually argue that the US government is actually worse at it than the rest of them. Are governments willing to experiment on citizens? Absolutely. One big thing, the Tuskegee experiments. Under the guise of free healthcare, the government infected about 300 black men with untreated syphilis and monitored them for decades. Now, I mean, that alone is awful, but that was just almost 100 years ago, and they haven't stopped yet. Operation Paperclip. Operation Paperclip is when the government brought over about 1,600 Nazi scientists, engineers, and had them continue their experimentation under the U.S. protection. So none of them faced retribution or justice for what they did during the Holocaust and against Jews. The U.S. government brought them over to continue their experimentation. Operation Sea Spray. Operation Sea Spray is where the DoD actually was dumping live bacteria over major cities, and it was enough that even back then people were able to identify a pattern of people getting sick when they were spraying the sky, and there was one confirmed death. Now I'd like to make the argument that to actually confirm that one death is pretty impressive, especially that if someone just got sick and died, oh, it's influenza, and it would never be reported as being tied to this operation. Next up, we have MK Ultra. MK Ultra was all about the LSD and mind control Manchurian candidates trying to create assassins, which actually plays a role in coming up in the next slide. MK Ultra was absolutely real when it was discovered and actually came out in public. What they did was they shut down the program and started up a new one under a new name and just continued to that. And that's the government's MO, is that when something like this is discovered, they close it down, they shut it down, saying, look, we're doing something good, but then they start it back up under a new name. And then the last one for experiments I'd like to point out is the COVID-19 and the vaccination effort that they pushed. It was, from my research, the largest experimentation in written human history involving billions of people. So we'll see where that one goes, but it's not looking good. So let's see, next up, is the government willing to reduce global populations? A lot of people like to, when you make that argument that, hey, government is trying to reduce the population, people like to say, no, it's not. However, I like to point out the Kissinger report from Henry Kissinger, who worked with the NSA and CIA to produce this report. This report details how the U.S. government can reduce populations of third world countries to maintain socio and economic control over those. However, this report also stated that whatever they do over there, they must do here stateside, so they eliminate the idea that we're actually targeting third world countries. We're like, look, we're doing it to everyone. So a lot of the population reduction tactics and things like that you actually see happening here in the U.S., and it's because of this report from then. Are governments willing to commit acts of terrorism? Obviously, yes, based on even just the definition of terrorism. But first one I'd like to talk about is Operation Northwoods. Operation Northwoods is an operation that the DoD tried to push during the Cuban crisis. The idea was to attack U.S. citizens to drum up support for the Cuban crisis. JFK said no to this one, but it was still an official report or operation that they tried to greenlight. So it just shows even then, and the government has only gotten worse since then, that they were absolutely willing to commit terrorist attacks against U.S. citizens to drum up support for whatever they're trying to do. Next up, 9/11. 9/11 was an inside job. The engineers and architects of 9/11, they even confirmed that all three buildings, both Trade Centers and World Trade Center 7, were all demoed. They also said that a plane also hit the Pentagon. I believe that what hit the Pentagon either was a missile or a drone with a missile, because the drone program skyrocketed after that. Now, I do want to talk about 9/11. Now, I mentioned previously that the day before 9/11, Rumsfeld came out and said that the DoD couldn't account for $2.4 trillion. Very next day, all of the auditors and all the financial records for that paper trail were all destroyed. So clearly, I believe it was targeted. I actually am presenting at the Fire Steel Hub on Saturday at 6. I'm going over plasma cosmology, a theory of everything. I believe what I'll discuss in that is the reason why they attacked the Pentagon, not just to hide the information, but really where the money was going, because the money didn't leave the U.S. economy. That amount of money back then would have collapsed the economy. What I believe was that it was funneled to special projects that most people don't know about, like the underground cities and highway systems that have been built over decades all across the U.S. Next up, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, ISIL, that's still ongoing. There is actually strong evidence to suggest that the U.S. with the CIA, Mossad, and MI6 were heavily involved in setting up Al-Qaeda. And then speaking about propaganda and them, from 2007 to 2011, the Pentagon paid a PR firm $500 million to create fake Al-Qaeda videos to drum up support for the Iraq war. the beheadings and things like that. And interesting enough also is that in the 90s, the Israeli Secret Intelligence Service, ISIS, was a thing, and now we have ISIS here, obviously with a different term, but I just thought that was an interesting anecdotal connection. The US government has done bomb attacks, coups, attempted regime changes in over 43 countries worldwide, and probably a lot more since World War II. I would like to actually make the argument that the US government has worked in and infiltrated every country in the world and has a finger on all continents. Are governments willing to assassinate political leaders? Yes. JFK assassination. In my book, I actually dove into the JFK assassination and found some very interesting things. There is a picture of Oswald outside of the library as the motorcade was going by. At least it looks like him. And if it is him, then he definitely wasn't the one to pull the trigger. When he was initially arrested, he was arrested for the murder of a Dallas cop who I actually believe was the initial shooter. And he said that he was being set up as a patsy. After he was arrested for shooting the cop, that's when they added on that, oh, you also must have shot JFK, and they tacked that onto him. Now, Oswald, when he was in the Marines, he was stationed in Japan, and that location actually was an MK Ultra location. One of the MK Ultra scientists was actually a psychiatrist, and he was assigned to Jack Ruby after Ruby killed Oswald, which then, of course, he said, oh, well, Ruby's insane, and that's why they locked him up. There is also evidence to suggest that Oswald met with the CIA and KGB in the months leading up to JFK's assassination. Now, there's a bunch of different reasons on potentially why they attacked JFK, but there is absolute evidence to suggest that the CIA was the ones pulling the trigger and doing everything. I do want to point out that the idea of a second gunman, like on the grassy knoll, if you watch the video, and I analyzed it for a while, if you look at his driver breaks protocol after the first shot, turns around, faces JFK, raises his arm, then drops it after JFK's head goes back and to the left, and then drives away. I think that what the driver did was had some kind of like, not the heart attack gun that the CIA had, but some mechanic device that was powderless and soundless so you couldn't see it. And that is what only works on like close quarters. And the driver was the second actual shooter, and there wasn't a second shooter on the grassy knoll. To this actual conspiracy and point about them assassinating political leaders, the government has assassinated thousands of targets over the last 100 years, and I'm pretty sure that number is a low estimate. Are governments being run by pedophiles? Well, Epstein sure as shit didn't kill himself. So, and all of Epstein's client lists, none of those have been made public. No one's talking about it. If you actually watch and see for a long enough timeline, you'll see politicians, aides, things like that. A lot of people are being arrested for child sex crimes. There was one senior advisor, Rami Shai, who was a senior advisor to Obama. He came out saying that the idea of Pizzagate was fake. When information came out that the Podestas were involved with child trafficking and things like that, he was saying Pizzagate was fake, that wasn't going on. He was actually recently arrested for child sex offenses in the UK. Now, I do want to bring up Pizzagate. A lot of people, when they go, oh, Pizzagate wasn't real, things like that, because the Pizzagate, when they were talking about it, is that they were transferring children from a basement. Well, the pizza parlor that everyone talks about doesn't have a basement, the same one that gunman went in there and shot up. The problem is only 2 doors down was another pizza parlor owned by the same group of people, and that one absolutely did have a basement. So I gotta speed this up. So let's see, is there international body and corporations plotting something sinister? We have the World Economic Forum, Agenda 2030. They want to align everyone with the UN's social and economic goals. And basically the idea is that every man, woman, and child on earth, one of them is, at least under the health, that everyone is vaccinated, every man, woman, and child on earth. Great Reset, Build Back Better. COVID-19 was used to help springboard this idea of Great Reset, which is just resetting capitalism to a different way of how it's ran. Still the same premise, just government's not in control. It's really corporations that are pushing everything. Build Back Better, that phrase was used by Biden, the UK PM, the Canadian PM. It just shows that this rhetoric was all a coordinated effort and not just one person coming up with a slogan. ID 2020 and the digital currency, they're using to tie all of that together so that they can actually shut down our accounts. China is doing this, and there's several other countries that have already started following suit. So be on the lookout that all of this is actually in our near future. BlackRock, Vanguard, they have $18 trillion in assets, and they own everything. Every major corporation, all of our food, water, oil, all of that is owned by these companies. And they only have to own a small portion, 5–10% of a major corporation, and they sit on the board of directors and make changes and discussions on what is there. This is why our food is being poisoned, because these people are actually poisoning us from within. Last up, the Bilderberg Group in Bohemian Grove. The Bilderberg Group actually meets every year. It's the one where I want to say either Bilderberg Group or Bohemian Grove, I forget which one, that Alex Jones initially springboarded his career by infiltrating and recording. So these people are meeting every year, and it is often in secret, and we have no idea what they're doing. So it's not a hard jump to assume that some of them, at least, are plotting sinister things. So I want to talk about anarchism now. Everything before that I've just discussed is how I view government, that it is tyrannical in nature, and it is a fallacious idea to believe in that it can be anything other than tyrannical. Anarchy means without rulers and the absence of government, that tool or action of control over the innocent. So when I say I'm an anarchist, this is what I mean is that it does not involve that tyranny, that action of control over the innocent. So anarchism is a system or practice of no rulers, voluntary action, and absence of government over the innocent. It does not mean without rulers, principles, leaders, or hierarchies. It just means no rulers. So there is a very different intent. A leader can be followed through voluntary means. A ruler is someone who uses force, or typically uses force and intimidation to control people. So when I say I'm an anarchist, this is what I mean. I believe in all forms of anarchy as long as it's through voluntary means, ANCOMs, ANCAPs. I don't care as long as it's voluntary. So my whole point is we can do better. We just have to understand that government is a root cause for the issues we see, and we just have to find a better way to do things. So do you believe the government is needed and can work still? And then what will it take to evolve humanity past the need of being controlled? I believe that we can have free and organized communities based on natural rights, life, freedom, and property, and that we use facilitating systems to help these communities function and communicate with each other, and it doesn't need the idea of what I just prevented as government. So we have a chance to break this endless cycle of tyranny. We can be defiant in the face of tyranny, in the face of statism, and we should be striving for evolution, not revolution. Thank you. Here's my email. I have business cards. I also have bookmarks. I have my books available. I'm mainly available through Instagram. That's where I'm mostly active. And then my website, journalisticrevolution.com, has all of my work on it except like my book. And if we don't have time for questions, I'll absolutely stand to the side and to talk with anyone for however long, and I'm here until Sunday. Okay.
Yes, we have time for questions?
Yeah, I guess so.
Okay, so first of all, impressive.
Thank you.
Secondly, if just going back to your slides on conspiracy theory, could you please spend a moment or two talking about Bill Gates?
Bill Gates? Every aspect of COVID-19 that I researched and found had Bill Gates' fingerprints all over it. The idea of having to wear a mask and that mask would actually benefit us and save us. Those statistics actually came from a Bill Gates company that then the Trump administration used to push on why masks are important. Bill Gates was behind the creation of COVID, the vaccines. He is literally pushing the direction we are going for this new world order, and he is basically the road barrier. Now, I don't believe he is the one really in charge pulling strings. I think he is just a tool being used and has the money to get things done. Because my research into Epstein, which I believe was a Mossad agent, or at least an asset for Mossad, actually told Bill Gates to invest like $1 million or $2 million into one of his, Epstein's research projects through MIT, which Bill Gates did. And interesting enough that Epstein died right before COVID happened, and as information was coming out to Bill Gates' tie to Epstein. So, and I'll be happy to discuss even more details with you if you want on it. And in my book, I've detailed everything with references to Bill Gates' involvement with COVID.
Hey, Jeffrey, I wanted to know, what was your initial contact with the Trivium? How did you find that through? What was your source for that?
I actually, I learned about it through an associate of mine in 2015. He actually learned it through Tragedy and Hope and Richard Grove and all of them. So that is where I learned that information, and it's a very simple process, and I took it with an OCD fever, and I've applied it to every aspect of my life. Anything I do, live, breathe, I start grammar, logic, and rhetoric to go in that order to try to make sure I have the most correct and truthful information possible. But that is where I first learned about the Trivium, was through that. Any other questions? Nope? All right. Well, I appreciate it. Thank you.